There's a certain kind of haunting in the world of music. It's not the ghostly wail of a theremin or the eerie strings in a horror movie score. It's the ghost of a name that wrote the soundtrack to millions of lives, to first dances, to last goodbyes, to lonely nights spent staring at a radio dial, but a name that somehow history forgot to remember. It's the story of the person who gave the world a song that everyone knows, but whose own story remains an echo. We all know the song, "I Can't Stop Loving You." It's been sung by over 700 artists. It's been a blockbuster hit for Ray Charles, a country standard, a pop culture touchstone. It's a song that feels like it's always existed, like a folk tune passed down through generations. But it wasn't. It was written on a single gloomy afternoon in 1957 in a small trailer home in Knoxville, Tennessee, by a man whose heart was breaking. That man's name was Don Gibson. And his story, well, it's a classic, tragic country ballad in its own right. It's the story of a man they called the sad poet, a man who could distill universal heartbreak into 3 perfect minutes, but who spent a lifetime battling the very demons that fueled his genius. This is the story of the man behind one of the world's most enduring love songs, and the quiet, lonely road he walked long after the music faded. To understand Don Gibson, you have to understand the world he was born into. Imagine Shelby, North Carolina, in 1928. This wasn't the glittering Nashville of today. This was the hardscrabble rural South still reeling from the Great Depression. Life was etched into the faces of the people who worked the cotton mills and tobacco farms. It was a world of dirt roads, Sunday sermons, and front porch music. For a poor boy like Don, the 7th and youngest child of a railroad worker, life wasn't about dreaming of stardom. It was about survival. His father, Solon, died from a heart attack when Don was just 2 years old, a loss that cast a long shadow over the family. His mother, Mary, was left to raise 7 children on her own, a monumental task in an era with no social safety net. Don dropped out of school in the 2nd grade, not because he wasn't bright, but because the world of books and blackboards seemed a universe away from the immediate pressing needs of his family. He was, by his own admission, a hillbilly, a term he used without shame, but with a full understanding of the poverty and lack of opportunity it implied. Music, for Don, wasn't a career choice, it was a lifeline. It was the one thing that lifted him out of the drudgery of mill work and odd jobs. He and his friends would huddle around the radio, mesmerized by the sounds coming from the Grand Ole Opry in Nashville. They'd listen to the pioneers of country music, Roy Acuff, Ernest Tubb, Hank Williams. These weren't just singers, they were storytellers, men who sang about the very life Don knew, hardship, heartache, and the simple fleeting joys that made it all bearable. He picked up a guitar and started to mimic them, learning by ear, his fingers finding the chords that seemed to match the ache in his own young heart. He formed his first band, the Sons of the Soil, in the mid-1940s. They were local boys playing for local crowds, in smoky bars and dance halls, where the music was just as important as the cheap beer. This was Don's real education. He learned how to hold a crowd, how to sing over the noise of a rowdy Saturday night, and most importantly, how to connect with people through a song. He wasn't a virtuoso, and his voice wasn't a powerhouse like some of his contemporaries, but it had something else, something more potent, a palpable vulnerability. When Don Gibson sang, you believed him. You could hear the crack in his voice, the tremor of sadness that lay just beneath the surface. It was a voice that seemed to know loneliness intimately. And in the post-war South, a land of quiet, stoic men and women, that kind of emotional honesty was a revelation. This was the soil from which the sad poet would grow, a place where sorrow was a part of the landscape, and music was the only way to give it a voice. Don Gibson's journey from the dusty bars of North Carolina to the hallowed halls of Nashville was a slow, grinding climb. It was a decade of paying dues, of playing for pocket change, of honing his craft in relative obscurity. He was a working musician, a journeyman, not a star. He had a local radio show on WOHS in his hometown of Shelby, and he recorded a few sides for small, independent labels. The songs were good, but they didn't catch fire. They were solid country tunes, but they were missing that spark, that indefinable quality that turns a song into a hit. By the mid-1950s, Don was starting to feel the gnawing ache of failure. He was married with a family to support, and the life of a struggling musician was taking its toll. He found himself in Knoxville, Tennessee, living in a trailer park, his dreams feeling more distant than ever. It was here, in this moment of quiet desperation, that everything changed. The year was 1957. Don was sitting in his trailer on a gray, drizzly afternoon. He was broke, he was lonely, and he was feeling utterly defeated. He later described that day with a stark, simple clarity. I was out in the back of the trailer in a little old shack, and I wrote, "I Can't Stop Loving You," and "Oh, Lonesome Me," the same afternoon. Think about that for a moment. Two of the most iconic songs in the history of country music, born from a single 3-hour burst of melancholic inspiration. It wasn't a planned writing session. It was an emotional exorcism. He picked up his guitar and the words just tumbled out, fully formed, as if they had been waiting in the shadows of his mind. "I Can't Stop Loving You" was a masterpiece of simplicity. The lyrics were direct, almost conversational, yet they captured a feeling of obsessive, unrequited love that was universally understood. There's no fancy wordplay, no complex metaphors. It's just raw, honest pain. And then there was, "Oh, Lonesome Me." If "I Can't Stop Loving You" was a tear-stained ballad, "Oh, Lonesome Me" was its jaunty, deceptively upbeat cousin, with its clever, self-pitying lyrics and catchy, shuffling rhythm. It was a song you could tap your feet to, even as you recognized the profound loneliness at its core. He had managed to bottle two distinct flavors of heartbreak: the deep, abiding ache and the slightly manic, almost comical despair of a Saturday night with no one to call. Armed with these two self-penned gems, Don landed a recording session with the legendary producer Chet Atkins at RCA Victor in Nashville. Atkins, a guitar virtuoso and a man with an unparalleled ear for a hit, immediately recognized the potential in Gibson's songs. But he also saw something more. He heard a unique sound. Don's style wasn't pure honky-tonk, and it wasn't the slick, string-laden pop that was starting to emerge. It was something in between. Atkins made a crucial decision. He stripped back the traditional fiddle and steel guitar that were the hallmarks of country music at the time. Instead, he built the sound around a tight rhythm section, a chorus of backing vocalists, and Don's own rhythmic, percussive acoustic guitar playing. The result was revolutionary. It was clean, it was crisp, it was modern. It would come to be known as the Nashville Sound, a style that would dominate country music for years and cross over to the pop charts. And Don Gibson was one of its primary architects. In late 1957, RCA released "Oh, Lonesome Me." It was a smash. The song shot to #1 on the country charts, and more importantly, crossed over to the top 10 on the pop charts. It was a rare feat for a country artist at the time. The B-side of that single was, of course, "I Can't Stop Loving You." While it didn't chart on its own initially, it was quickly recognized by other artists as a diamond in the rough. The floodgates had opened. In the years that followed, Don Gibson became one of the most reliable hitmakers in Nashville. He churned out classics like "Blue, Blue Day," "Sea of Heartbreak," and "Sweet Dreams," a song he had written years earlier that would become a signature hit for Patsy Cline. He was inducted into the Grand Ole Opry in 1958, cementing his place among the country music elite. He had finally arrived. The poor boy from Shelby was a star. But as is so often the case in these stories, the light that burns the brightest often casts the darkest shadows. The very sensitivity that allowed him to write such profound songs of heartbreak was also his greatest vulnerability. Behind the bright lights of the Opry and the gold records lining his walls, Don Gibson was a man in turmoil. The sad poet wasn't just a nickname. It was a painfully accurate description of his inner world. He was shy, introverted, and plagued by a crippling lack of self-confidence. In a world of swaggering, larger-than-life performers, Don often seemed small and fragile, lost in the glare of the spotlight. He once told an interviewer, "I was so shy, it was painful. I'd be up on stage and I'd be dying inside." This deep-seated insecurity was a constant companion, a ghost that whispered words of doubt even as the crowds roared their approval. To cope with the pressure, the loneliness of the road, and his own internal demons, Don turned to pills and alcohol. It was a tragically common story in the high-pressure world of entertainment, and Don fell into the trap head first. He became what was known in the industry as a pillhead, dependent on amphetamines to get him on stage and barbiturates to bring him down. This wasn't a secret whispered in back rooms. It was a visible, painful struggle. His performances became erratic. Sometimes he would be brilliant, his voice filled with that signature aching beauty. Other times, he would be a shadow of himself, stumbling through lyrics, his eyes hollow and distant. His personal life was just as turbulent. He was married and divorced 3 times. His most significant relationship was with his second wife, Bobby Patterson. She was a singer herself, and for a time, she became his anchor. She tried to help him fight his addictions, managing his affairs, and providing a semblance of stability in his chaotic life. But the strain was immense. Don's addictions were a destructive force, eroding trust and creating a gulf between them. There's a heartbreaking anecdote from this period that perfectly captures the tragedy of his situation. He was booked for a major show, a performance that could have been a career highlight, but he was so deep in the throes of his addiction that he simply couldn't go on. Bobby, in a desperate attempt to save the gig and protect his reputation, went on stage in his place. She sang his songs, trying to channel his spirit, while the man himself was somewhere in the darkness, lost to his own sorrow. It was during this dark period that perhaps the most telling incident of his career occurred, one that reveals the profound disconnect between the man and his music. Ray Charles, the transcendent genius of soul music, decided to record an album of country songs. For the centerpiece of the album, he chose "I Can't Stop Loving You." Charles transformed the song. He slowed it down, added a lush orchestra and a gospel choir, and infused it with a depth of soul and passion that was breathtaking. His version, released in 1962, became a global phenomenon. It was a #1 hit in the US, the UK, and all over the world. It sold millions of copies and won a Grammy Award. It made "I Can't Stop Loving You" an immortal standard. And what was Don Gibson's reaction? He was, by all accounts, deeply conflicted. On one hand, the royalties from Ray Charles's version made him a wealthy man. It was financial security beyond his wildest dreams. But on the other hand, the song was no longer his. It had become so intertwined with Ray Charles that many people didn't even know Don had written it. He had given his most personal expression of heartbreak to the world, and the world had given it to someone else. He once wryly remarked, "I'm a millionaire, but I'm still a hillbilly." The money couldn't fill the void. It couldn't quiet the voice of insecurity that told him he wasn't good enough. He had written the song, but Ray Charles had owned it. It was the ultimate irony for a man who craved validation. His greatest success was also his greatest disappearing act. The song became a giant, casting a shadow so large that the man who wrote it was lost within it. In the late 1950s and early 60s, a schism was forming in country music. On one side, you had the purists, the traditionalists who clung to the raw, gritty sound of honky-tonk, the fiddles, the steel guitars, the unvarnished tales of drinking and cheating. On the other side, you had the architects of the Nashville Sound, like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, who were smoothing out the country's rough edges. They were adding string sections, vocal choruses, and polished production techniques to make the music more palatable to a wider, more pop-oriented audience. Don Gibson was right at the epicenter of this shift. His hits, like Oh, Lonesome Me, were prime examples of this new, crossover-friendly sound. Many purists saw this as a betrayal. They felt the music was losing its soul, its connection to its rural working-class roots. Was Don Gibson a visionary who pushed country music forward, or was he a sellout who sanitized it for commercial gain? The truth, as it often is far more nuanced. Don wasn't a cynical businessman chasing a trend. The Nashville Sound suited his artistic temperament perfectly. His songwriting was already more introspective and pop-inflected than that of his honky-tonk peers. The clean, sparse arrangements allowed the emotional core of his lyrics and the vulnerability in his voice to shine through. He wasn't abandoning his roots so much as he was finding the perfect frame for his particular brand of melancholy. However, this success came with a hidden cost. The very polish that made his records hits also created a distance. The raw, desperate musician from the Knoxville trailer park was now a sophisticated recording artist. But was he happier? The evidence suggests not. This leads to the second, more personal debate, the nature of his sadness. Was Don Gibson's persona as the sad poet a genuine reflection of his soul? Or was it, to some extent, a brand? There's no question that his struggles with depression and addiction were terrifyingly real. Friends and fellow musicians spoke of his genuine shyness and his crippling insecurity. Webb Pierce, a fellow country star, once said, Don Gibson could walk into a room full of people and find the darkest corner to stand in. This wasn't an act. Yet, in the world of country music, sadness sells. Heartbreak is the genre's currency. Did the industry, and even Don himself, begin to commodify his pain? When an artist's identity becomes synonymous with their suffering, it can create a feedback loop. The more he was celebrated as the sad poet, the harder it may have been for him to escape that role, both on stage and off. His identity became a cage, gilded with gold records. He was trapped in the persona of the heartbroken man, expected to endlessly reproduce the very feelings that were destroying him. This was never allowed public debate, but a quiet, insidious pressure that defined his life. He had the success he had dreamed of, but it was built on a foundation of his own sorrow. The world loved the songs that his pain produced, but it seemed to have little time for the man himself. This is the quiet controversy of Don Gibson's life, the story of a man who was celebrated for his ability to articulate loneliness, and in being so celebrated was perhaps left more alone than ever. The legacy of Don Gibson isn't just a collection of hit songs. It's a fundamental thread woven into the fabric of modern music. His influence is both vast and subtle, often felt by people who may not even know his name. To understand his significance, we have to look beyond the charts and see the deeper impact he had on songwriting, on sound, and on the very emotional language of popular music. First and foremost, Don Gibson was a songwriter. He was inducted into the Nashville Songwriters Hall of Fame in its inaugural class in 1973. alongside legends like Hank Williams, Felice and Boudleaux Bryant, and Cindy Walker. This wasn't just a token honor, it was a recognition of his profound impact on the craft. Before Gibson, country songwriting, while often brilliant, could be lyrically and structurally rigid. Don brought a new kind of simplicity and emotional directness to the form. He wrote with what the author Nicholas Dawidoff called a bleak, modern, adult outlook. His songs weren't just stories about events, they were explorations of internal states of being, of loneliness, obsession, and regret. This introspective psychological approach opened up new possibilities for country music and influenced generations of writers who followed, from Willie Nelson and Chris Christopherson to the sensitive, confessional songwriters of today. His second major contribution was his role as a pioneer of the Nashville Sound. While Chet Atkins was the producer and visionary, Don was one of its first and most successful test pilots. The crossover success of Oh, Lonesome Me and I Can't Stop Loving You, even before the Ray Charles version, proved that there was a massive audience for a smoother, more sophisticated style of country music. This sound bridged the gap between rural America and the burgeoning suburbs. It took country music out of the honky-tonks and into the living rooms of mainstream America. This commercial explosion helped turn Nashville into the global music powerhouse it is today. Without the groundwork laid by artists like Don Gibson, Jim Reeves, and Patsy Cline, the genre's trajectory would have been vastly different. But perhaps his most enduring legacy is the sheer unstoppable power of a single song, I Can't Stop Loving You. The history of popular music can be told through a handful of songs that transcended their genre and became part of our collective cultural DNA. This is one of those songs when Ray Charles recorded it, he didn't just create a hit, he created a landmark cultural event. A black R&B artist taking a country song and turning it into a worldwide soul anthem was a powerful statement in a still segregated America. The song became a bridge, a testament to the universal power of music to erase boundaries. Over 700 artists have recorded it, from Frank Sinatra to Van Morrison to Elvis Presley. Each interpretation finds a new facet in its simple, perfect expression of longing. Don Gibson's life serves as a poignant cautionary tale. It's the ultimate story of the tragic hitmaker, the artist whose personal pain becomes public property. He gave the world songs of profound emotional honesty, but he struggled to find peace in his own life. He achieved immense financial success, yet remained plagued by the insecurities of his impoverished youth. His story reminds us to look behind the song, to remember the human being who bled onto the page to create the art we love. Don Gibson still matters because he represents that fragile, often heartbreaking contract between the artist and the audience. He gave us a piece of his soul, and in return his music achieved a kind of immortality that the man himself could never quite grasp. He was the sad poet, and his verses are still being sung long after he fell silent. In the end, the story of Don Gibson comes full circle, back to a place of quiet and solitude. After years of battling his demons, he finally found a measure of peace in his later life. He kicked his addictions in the 1980s, a hard-won victory that allowed him a final act of quiet dignity. He continued to record and perform, though never with the same commercial success of his heyday. He settled back in Nashville, living a relatively reclusive life with his third wife, Bobby, whom he had remarried. The roaring crowds and the pressures of stardom faded into the background, replaced by the gentle rhythm of a life lived outside the spotlight. He passed away on November 17, 2003, at the age of 75. There was no grand public mourning, no 24-hour news cycle dedicated to his death. It was a quiet passing for a man who, despite his enormous success, had always seemed more comfortable in the shadows. He was buried in his hometown of Shelby, North Carolina, the hillbilly boy returning to the soil that shaped him. His headstone is simple, engraved with his name, dates, and the title that defined him, the Sad Poet. His story is also a powerful reminder of the ephemeral nature of fame versus the permanence of a great song. Names fade, faces are forgotten, but a melody, a lyric that perfectly captures a feeling, can live forever. Don Gibson may be the ghost in the machine of popular music, the forgotten architect of a sound we all know, but every time a lonely heart finds comfort in I Can't Stop Loving You, or a foot taps along to the self-deprecating wit of Oh Lonesome Me, Don Gibson's spirit is there. He is the quiet man in the corner of the room, the sad poet whose words speak louder and last, longer than any applause. He may have died in silence, but his music ensures he will never truly be gone.